happy to inaugurate with David Carter, who's a celebrity, who used to be a celebrity in theory and is now also a celebrity in HCI. Who knows what he'll tell us about today, but we're super excited to have him here. And I guess you can ask questions, and he might just ignore you.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah. So thanks very much. It's fun to inaugurate a room. For those from the, I see some theory people in the audience, and I'll have to disappoint you. That's not what I'll be talking about today. Although I'll probably come back and give another theory talk sometime later. XKCD has this book they published of describing everything using only the 1,000 most common words in the English language, and they set a challenge to the academics at my department to do the same. So this is sort of me. I basically like to study tools that help people manage information. And sort of a general theme in the work is that computers are making people dumb. And we need to change the computers to allow people to be smart the way people are. In particular, people are very talented masters of information. We have lots of domain experts and people who know what they want to do with their information. And they have their own ways of wanting to organize or visualize or explain that information. But they're really limited by current tools to whatever the developer thought was the right way to organize the information. And that just doesn't work because people can't express what they know and can't organize things in a way that makes sense to them. And so this is a problem. This is not a machine learning problem. Okay, I mean, just about everything is a machine learning problem these days, but this is not a machine learning problem because if people are prevented from putting information into the computer, then it's not there. And so the computer cannot magically cause that information to materialize. Instead, I focus on tools that let the computer capture more information from the human in order to make the organization better. I work in sort of two spaces. One is to look at online discussion tools, which is what I'll be focusing on today. I also do work on letting end users build their own information management applications, which is a whole sort of separate line of work. Really, my picture of current tools is that you've got this very smart human being with a very complicated picture in their head, and then we give them this very limited interface where they can only express a tiny fraction of what they know and understand. And then we throw all of this computation, look very carefully at the tiny bit of information that they presented, and of course the computer figures out something entirely different because there just isn't enough signal from the human. So I'm going to talk today about how to bring these ideas of richer information models and more information towards online discussion. I'm going to be looking first at richer information structures, in particular how to use annotation and summarization to improve the quality of online discussions. And then I'll be looking also at richer workflows that let people have a better chance of controlling what they receive through mailing lists. We'll be looking specifically at online harassment and how people can manage that more effectively. The recipients, not the senders. And then we'll also be looking at automation of general social media. And in all of these, the theme is, well, that's interesting. Hello? In all of these, okay, I have to remember to press something every once in a while. The last time I gave a talk at Microsoft, my computer rebooted in the middle for a Windows update. Now, hopefully that's not going to happen again. So the theme of all of these tools is using the computer really as just a smart blackboard. It's the medium for the information, and it's not providing any real intelligence beyond what the human brings. So let's first talk about models. If we look at online discussion tools today, we see these giant streams of posts and replies to those posts. And the numbers are staggering. You can have hundreds of comments on a news article, thousands of comments on a Facebook post. There are 500,000 comments on certain YouTube videos. Do you suppose anybody has read those comments? Probably not. Commenting offers, and online discussion in general, offers a really impoverished user interface, which just is a linear stream of posts and replies to those posts. And pretty much all we've moved beyond that linear structure is the ability to like or tag things in a particular post. And there are sometimes in certain platforms these opaque tools for filtering the content in some way and showing you only a subset of it. Majority voting on Reddit, the mysterious Facebook feed, trending topics, and so forth. But the result of this giant stream of posts that you can't control is information overload. And I think what you get a lot of the times is write-only comment streams. So everybody is commenting and nobody is reading comments because there's too much and you can't find the stuff that you would actually want to pay attention to. And indeed, what we've been seeing for several years is news sites and other sites choosing to turn off comments entirely because they find that they're actually of negative value. The people at Popular Science did a study and they found out that people reading the comments on their articles developed less trust in science as a result of the trolling and negativity on those comment feeds. So they turned them off. I'm hoping we can do something better. And so for the first half of this talk, I want to tell you about two sort of richer ways of organizing discussion to make it more useful. So the first is a paper that comes out of a paper and work that we started in 2012 on placing discussion in the margins. And this we looked at specifically in the context of classroom discussion. So one place where discussion forums can be really useful is in the classroom, where students can ask each other questions and are not limited to interaction with the professor in class. They can get answers from other students, which provides a scalability that you don't have if there's only one faculty answering. You get this archival record of knowledge that can be helpful to the students. And also the faculty, by observing the discussion, may gain some insight into what is confusing the students and what needs to be improved in their teaching. There's also some interesting work from the education community that shows that discussion of education material is actually the best way for people to learn it. Michelle Chi developed this taxonomy and this hierarchy of different kinds of learning. So there's passively listening to a talk the way that you are now. I noticed that nobody is taking notes, which is just terrible because active note-taking improves your retention and learning of material. Even better is to do exercises, and I'll be handing out a few at the end of the talk. And best of all is to discuss the material with other students, to work collaboratively on solving problems and explaining things to each other. And she did some very nice control experiments in the study of mathematics that showed this improving quality of learning. So discussion forums have the potential to generate those sorts of productive discussions to help people learn. Unfortunately, discussion forums have a sort of context problem, right? You're reading your textbook and you get confused, so you go to the discussion forum and you post a question, and now you're online, so maybe it's you check Facebook and do some other things. You start multitasking. In the forum itself, you have to hunt around to see if somebody has asked your question before, if there's an answer to it. When you do the post, you have to describe the context of your question in great detail so that somebody can understand it well enough to answer it. If you want to be helpful, you have to go hunting through the forum for questions that you might answer when, maybe some of the questions are about material you haven't even reached yet in the textbook. And there's no structure. There's just this big linear series of posts that nobody can navigate. So our idea was that the content of the course, that textbook or the lecture notes, provide a context, and we could keep that context in the discussion by having the discussions in the margins of the text instead of having them in a separate discussion forum. So we built NB, which stands for Nota Bene, and it's a plain old threaded discussion forum, but it runs in the margins of the document that is being discussed. It's a standard website. The faculty sets up a class, uploads some PDF documents or points at some HTML documents, and then the students, when they log in, get a sidebar where a forum is situated and discussion can happen. And so this is a picture of the interface. On the left is the content, and you can see these little boxes that show places where students have chosen to annotate. And we've chosen sort of an inbox model, so you have sort of subject lines at the top associated with the different comments, and then when you click on one, you get the details of the entire discussion. And that's a threaded sort of reply-based discussion model because we want discussion to happen. Now, you can immediately see some interesting things. So here is a post whose content is, how did we get 3 from 1? Imagine if you saw a post like that in a standard discussion forum. What use would it be, right? You would have no understanding of the question. But because there is this linkage to the original content, it's very clear what the question is asking. The way it's used is pretty straightforward. If you want to make a post, you highlight a section of the document, and it opens up a box in which you can make a post. Once posts are there, if you see one, you can click on a box and be taken to the post. You can click on a post and be taken to the box. And when you're reading a post, you can hit reply and participate in the discussion. So this had a number of benefits. Going back to the problems I talked about before, this lets you stay in the flow of your reading without exiting the document. And it lets you see the discussion of what you're reading right now. So if you're confused, you just look in the side and you see what other students were confused about, and maybe one of them already addressed the thing that's confusing you. Conversely, if you understand the thing you're reading, you can look to the side and see if somebody's confused, and you can immediately answer their question and help them out. The context is clear, as I just showed you. Furthermore, the annotations can actually provide a sort of a heat map for the faculty member, right? Where are the students putting their comments? What are they confused about? And I'll come back to that later when I talk about the work that we're doing now. Now, annotation is not a new idea. Sorry, is there a, oh, there is. Okay. Annotation is not a new idea. This is a 2,000-year-old hypertext called the Babylonian Talmud. This is built off of a document called the Mishnah, which was published about 2,500 years ago. And that is the content of the original document. And a few hundred years later, when they decided they needed to interpret what was in that very terse original document, they annotated it, and they wrote lots and lots of commentary around the original document. Several hundred years after that, it was decided that the annotations were ambiguous and they needed to annotate the annotations. And so there's a whole nother layer that emerged in the Middle Ages. And finally, a fourth layer of interpretation happened in the 1700s and so forth. So 2,500-year-old hypertext, not a new idea. To have your discussions in context. More modern example is Don Knuth's Concrete Mathematics textbook. He actually, when he was drafting this, handed it out to the students and had them write comments in the margins. And when he published the book, he actually curated those marginal comments and put them into the margins of the publication. And this is one of my favorite textbooks. It is just full of life because of all of the commentary of the students. Watch out, you may not think this is interesting now, but just wait 5 pages and then you'll see why he's telling you about it now. And so if you really get the student voice, Concrete Mathematics by Don Knuth. Okay. All right, so how did we assess this tool? NB has been surprisingly successful. It's a horrible, clunky system that was built by a Mechie student who was teaching themselves to program while they were building it. Nevertheless, it's been used by about 700 classes around the world at 60 different universities. We're approaching 2 million comments, or actually may have passed it already, from 60,000 students in just about every imaginable topic of learning. And we've seen frequent reuse. People like what they're getting and they use it again. Statistics of sort of growth in number of comments per year. Since 2015, we've been doing a collaboration with UC Davis that has generated an insane amount of comments because their classes have 1,000 students in them every quarter. So I've broken those out. But basically, lots of universities, generating lots of comments. And on many, many different topics, from Shakespeare to material science to biology to philosophy and so forth. Back in 2012, before all of this success, we did a focused analysis of the first class to use NB, which was actually at MIT. It was a professor named Sanjay Mahajan who was teaching a course on approximation. He was actually a perfect subject because he had already been requiring students to annotate his textbook in paper. Like they would actually he would hand out chapters and they would have to hand back copies, and he would spend the whole night before the lecture reading all of the comments that the students had written on the lecture, on the textbook, and then revising his content. So this was an insanely dedicated faculty member who loved the idea of not having to do all of that in paper at the last minute. And so what did we see? We saw extensive in-depth discussion. We saw that about 3/4 of the questions that students were asking were resolved by other students in under an hour. They generated about 14, this was about 100 students. They generated about 14,000 annotations over the course of the semester. Many of them were not standalone annotations, but were parts of discussions. Many of those discussions were quite long, and they appeared all over the document. In terms of the content, about 1/4 of it was just substantive commentary on the material itself, ways to say things better. 1/3 was questions about concepts and about the meaning of the text. And then the remainder was answers to those questions and random humor and so forth. In terms of who answered the questions, about half of the questions were answered by students in the same thread, but interestingly enough, 1/10 of the questions were answered by students in a different thread. So rather than being organized by thread, the discussion was organized by where it was in the document. So students would actually refer to other nearby threads in what they were discussing. Faculty answered some of the questions as well. No, there is no, that's in our to-do list, but there is currently no way to sort of hyperlink between different threads or to have a annotation. Another thing we're talking about is having annotations that point to multiple parts of the document if you want to compare things. You're asking too many questions. No, sorry, go ahead.
Never mind.
Whoa, I've count Adam Kalai. That's awesome. Okay, sorry.
If a student wanted to ask, when is the test or something?
Right. So actually, in the earliest version of NB, we had a general discussion thing at the top, which we just inserted a blank page. Nobody used it, so we got rid of it relatively early. Because NB is contextual, it's not really good for logistics discussions. Piazza is a great tool for that sort of thing. But no, we've been focused on discussions of the course content itself. Okay. And of course, in an ideal world, you would be able to do both of these in one environment so that you didn't have to keep switching back and forth. What did users say? Well, they loved the amount of in-depth discussion that they were getting, and they loved the sort of collective intelligence of being able to access all of the other students' knowledge in order to understand the material. This may be MIT specific, but they really liked to see that they weren't the only confused student, but that, in fact, everybody else was also asking questions, helped them feel less stupid. Faculty were also very happy. They felt that the tool itself was very good, that the comment quality was very high, and they generally chose to reuse the tool. And this was despite this really clunky code and interface. What they loved was that they felt they really got a sense of the students, that the students came alive, and even the shy ones were sort of getting involved in this online discussion. They felt that real conversations and debates were happening, that they couldn't conjure in the classroom itself. Yes?
Is this anonymous?
So there are separate settings, so a student can post, if the faculty allows, then the student can post anonymous comments, although they are not anonymous to the faculty because we didn't want to have to deal with trolling inside of the class environment. But they're anonymous to other students. And so we found, there's not scientifically rigorous, but we found that in general, MIT students preferred to post anonymously, and students at Olin preferred to talk to each other by name. Interesting. We don't know quite what was going on there. And they really liked that they could sort of adapt to focus on what was confusing the students because of this sort of heat map effect. Okay, now a lot of this was stuff that would happen with any discussion forum. Right? So can we validate that having the context is useful? So NB was working as a forum, but context should be better. What was the evidence? Well, many people had tried forums before and failed to get meaningful conversations out of them. So here we had success, so something different. So the only difference was the context and annotation aspects, so we suspect that had some influence. We also got feedback that said that the context was helpful, that it allowed the faculty to discover areas of confusion in the text itself. And they could notice when students were misinterpreting a particular thing. So they explicitly said that it was an improvement over traditional discussion boards. We also saw, as I showed you at the beginning, these context-sensitive comments. So it's easier to ask your questions and have people understand them. We saw how responses were synthesizing proximate threads, which could never happen in a discussion forum. We also found that students were not printing their notes at all. which is weird because it's a lot easier to read paper than it is to read to read online. So somehow, what's the benefit of reading online is that you have access to the discussion forum, which you lose when you print. So again, a sort of an indirect sign of value of the comments. We also decided to measure this. There's also the value that the students are now showing that they're reading the material, right? So the faculty can see that students are active, and this encourages students to actually read. We also did an analysis of when students are commenting, right? So you could imagine that people read and then they go and post comments. But no, in fact, this is sort of a normalized timeline over a student's reading session. When did they post their comments? And you can see that the comment was happening all during the reading session and not at the end. So they were seeing things, responding to them, or asking questions in the middle of their reading without losing the flow of their reading through the text. And so I think this generated a critical mass for the discussion. It attracted eyeballs to a particular thread at just the right time. So the summary here is that annotation can work. It produces substantial student-student teaching, participation by everybody. And again, NB is a medium. There's no intelligence here. It's just a blackboard, but it provides a richer structure for the conversation. Yes?
If the course were offered twice in subsequent years or n times multiple years, would comments be retained or would they disappear?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Let me pause it park it for 2 slides, and then I'll come back to it. So the key here is giving people information in the right time and in the right context. So where are we trying to take this? Well, we've been working for several years more on this project. We're trying to analyze the comments to understand more about whether we can detect student confusion automatically. And we've actually explored this question of whether to keep the comments around. When I started this project, I figured that we would use this to create the perfect textbook, and then people wouldn't need to comment anymore, right? But if you think about this ICAP hierarchy, you want people to discuss. Right? You don't want the textbook to be perfect. You want conversation. So we did this experiment where we took the comments from one year and we found the long ones. And then we took the first post of the long comment and we copied that into the following year, but without the follow-on. And we discovered that that created statistically long discussions in the follow-on year. So it's possible to actually stimulate discussion of the material. And that's something that we want to carry farther forward as well. We're also looking at tools now to measure student confusion and engagement in the text and trying to figure out ways to actually show heat maps, richer heat maps to the faculty about, the students seem to be very confused here, they seem to be very bored here, to allow them to make revisions to improve the quality of the teaching. We've got other projects in annotation going on.
One follow-up. In terms of retaining content, how would it work with science that, say, evolves? So in machine learning, you have TensorFlow that 6 months from now it might look completely different, or Pluto is or isn't a planet, things like that.
Yeah, well, so NB is designed around content that doesn't change. I mean, it's actually very hard to keep track of where to move an annotation if an HTML document is edited. Again, coming back to this issue of reuse of comments, when somebody teaches a class again, they generally generate a new copy of the class. Sometimes they'll import their old material, but they'll just have a clean slate to start with because they want students discussing things over again. So we never really tried to address this question of how to preserve annotations over mutating content. Okay.
Where people can vote?
We did. It was half-baked, and we never really pushed it. And in the rebuild of NB that we're doing right now, we're trying to be a little bit more thoughtful about how that would work. We want to be careful about voting because we don't want to discourage students from participating in discussion. Yes?
Is there a scale at which it collapses into a YouTube comment section?
Yes, so in one of the very first uses of this tool, which was at Harvard, the professor required students to annotate, and he very rapidly started getting a lot of complaints from students who said that they couldn't annotate because everything had been said already. This was in a class of 100 students, so obviously they were wrong. But in order to address that problem, we created sectioning. And so we found that sort of a reasonable section size of about 30 students works well, and B, allows the faculty member to just partition their student into whatever sections they want, and then students only see the comments from their own section. Now that raises really interesting questions about, well, maybe you want to promote certain comments to full class visibility because they're very interesting and so forth, and there's a lot more to talk about there. Yeah?
Are you able to link commenting behavior to their performance in the class?
So there's a little comment grading module in NB that allows faculty to actually assign grades to comments. We've also done some studies that try to correlate, like, do people who comment a lot get high grades in the class? Or actually, grade is not an excellent measure because that may reflect sort of effort invested in the class, and so of course higher effort is going to lead to higher learning gains. But we've begun to do some studies that look at learning gains. There are these ways of sort of normalize. You give students a test at the beginning that helps you normalize their current level of understanding, and then you can look at how much they gain in understanding over the course of the semester. And this is the kind of work that we've got an NSF proposal in to do with UC Davis over the next few years. All right, so I guess I'm a quarter way through the talk and halfway through the time, so we'll see. We'll see what happens next. So the next kind of structure that I want to talk about is summarization. So again, with 1 million comments, you're not going to read them all, but it would be really nice if you could get the gist of what was being said about an article. You can use filtering or moderation, but that really doesn't guarantee coverage, right? You're only going to get some subset of the content, and who knows what was missing. You may not get all the perspectives or the key ideas, right? If there's a popular perspective and an unpopular perspective, then social moderation is going to completely hide the unpopular perspective, and you won't see it at all. So wouldn't it be nice if we could take this giant discussion and create a summary of it? But who's going to do the summarization work, and how will they do it, right? Who's going to summarize 500,000 comments? Many people are willing to write a post or write a comment, but nobody's willing to read an entire discussion. So can we somehow divvy up that task of summarization? So collaborative summarization has been done before. If you think about it, that's what a wiki is, right? Each Wikipedia article is a collaborative summarization of some piece of knowledge. But wikis are not perfect for the task that we're aiming at because that summary is not connected to the discussion at all. Right, so Quora has an answer wiki actually, where you can write a wiki response to a particular question, but it's not part of the discussion. So there's no provenance. Where did the content of that answer wiki come from? You also have no idea of how much of the discussion is in that summary, and no way of accessing more detail. And in the summary, you lose the individual voices of the discussion and have less motivation to contribute. So what we did was build a tool called Wickham that tries to kind of combine the good aspects of forums and wikis, thus the name. You start with a long discussion, and Wickham provides a workflow to allow this discussion to be summarized slowly. Basically, anyone reading a comment or a thread can summarize the little bit that they've read. And that summary then replaces the individual posts that they are summarizing. But anytime you want, you can expand that summary in order to see the posts that were summarized. So this lets one person summarize a little bit of the discussion. And it's sort of topology preserving, because what you summarize is a little subtree of the discussion. And it just collapses that subtree into a single node at the bottom of the discussion tree. And so you create this leaf, which is now the parent of all of the things that it's summarizing. Now, as more and more people do this, you may eventually summarize away all of the original posts, but now people can start to summarize the summaries, right? And then summarize the summaries of the summaries. And so you get this ever-shrinking representation of the discussion, which creates sort of recursive summarization process that eventually summarizes the entire discussion into a single node at the top. But it's an expandable summary. So we call that a summary tree. Right? It's sort of a richer structure that lets you investigate the discussion at whatever level of detail you choose. You can expand the parts that you think are interesting in order to find out more about them. So compared to a wiki Wickham shows you what has been summarized and what has not. It's in the display, and it connects the summaries to the discussion that has been summarized. And it also breaks the summarization task into these manageable pieces so that different people can do it, although we have found that this breaking up of the task is useful even for an individual who wants to summarize something by themselves. Yes?
Is it, like, if you're doing a summary, are you limited to, like, geographically close?
Geographically in the threading sense, topologically close. No, it's actually topology. So Wickham was originally aimed at threaded discussions. So what you would be generally doing is summarizing a bunch of replies to the same comment. And so you'd be shrinking things up from the leaves. Now you can also summarize any sort of bunch of disconnected items, and they just get drawn together into a sort of a single tree node.
What happens if the discussion keeps going?
So that's our future work. So in the old version of in the version of Wickham that we built, the use was to summarize a sort of a finished discussion. But I have a master's student who's going to be spending the next year on integrating summarization into the discussion process itself, so that you can start replying to summaries and so forth. So here's just some little snapshots. You can play with Wickham. It's online at wickham.org. But this is sort of just a quick snapshot of the summarization interface. You basically select a bunch of comments over here, and it gives you this box which shows the comments and allows you to write a summary. It includes some very nice functionality. There's this tree visualization on the left to let you kind of find this. The blue and the orange refer to summarized and unsummarized parts of the discussion, so you can find a section to summarize. It also includes this editing modal for summarizing groups of comments. Within that editing modal, you can quote individual posts and cite them, and those become live links within the summary. We also try to guide people to do summarization of the right stuff by highlighting things that we think are important. So this is a limited use of machine learning within the tool. We also put a max length restriction in order to prevent the summary from being longer than the original posts, because we don't want to get into an infinite loop. So this means that you still have all the forum benefits where everybody can contribute their own perspective, but has the downside of all this redundancy and the need to read the entire argument. We've combined it with the aspects of a wiki where the community can create a short consensus article and remove all of that redundancy. But at the same time, we give you this ability to expand and dig down into more and more detail. So.
People have the incentive to
Well, it's a very reasonable question, and I'll point to two things, right? So first of all, we know that people have an incentive to discuss because of all of those posts that we see in discussion tools. We also see through Wikipedia that there is at least some group of people who have an interest in curating knowledge, right? And so you don't need everybody to be involved in the summarization process, but you need a group of people who have that motivation. And this may vary from community to community. So how do we evaluate this? We wanted to evaluate two things. We wanted to evaluate the summarization process. How easy is it to summarize? And we also wanted to evaluate the summarization product. Is the resulting summary useful? So to evaluate the process, we took 3 long discussions, and from each we selected enough comments that they require about 40 minutes of reading time at a normal speed. That means they were about 8,000 words. And we did these 2 evaluations. One of the process and one of the product. To evaluate the process, we got a bunch of participants, and we had each of them spend some time learning the tool, and then do 2 different summarization tasks. First, they had to summarize one of these discussions using Google Docs, which is a wiki. Then they had to summarize another discussion using Wickham. So Google Docs was our control. And each person in the group built on the work that the previous person in their group had done on that particular article. So this is what things looked like starting in Wickham with nothing summarized. We pasted the same discussion into Google Docs to get that wiki environment, and then we let people go. So we got this partially complete summary in Wickham, and in Google Docs we got this mess. Okay, because a plain old wiki is not great for incremental summarization of material. In terms of the results, here we see solid lines which show progress in summarization of Wickham articles over over a given number of users. And the dashed lines, we see summarization in the Google Doc condition, where you can see that the progress kind of flattens out, and they never reach full summarization of the articles.
So what is the measure of full summarization?
Length. So if the length reaches 0, then it is fully summarized. Okay, so down, you can think of the 1 minus the version of this, right? So this means that it's 100% of the original length of the discussion, and it shrinks to 0% of the length of the original discussion.
Another measure could be you show the summaries to people and see how well how highly they rate them in terms of...
So that's the product question. So let me get to that in just a minute. So we want to finish up with the process. So we found that people did not like edit. So Wickham is actually a wiki, so anybody can edit a summary after it's been created, but nobody did. Okay, it seems that in this context, at least, people did not like editing each other's work, unlike Wikipedia, say. Users also reported that as they were trying to summarize, they had to spend a lot of time just reading through the Google Doc in order to figure out the state of the summary process, which is not surprising because Google Doc didn't show you the state of the summary process. We encourage people to cross out things when they summarize them and otherwise, but the signals were very poor. People really felt that Wickham improved this summarization workflow, and they would be, they really liked the fact that summarizing everything seemed overwhelming, but just summarizing a little bit was a simple task, and so that's what they did. They also really like the provenance aspect, that the way in which you can cite paragraphs and posts is very useful to have a sense of why is this a valid summary? Did it do a good job of capturing what's underneath? So we also needed to evaluate the product, as you just asked about. And so what we did was, in the full discussion, before we started anything, we identified 12 topics that were substantial within the discussion. And you remember these were very long discussions, so we were actually having the people summarize only a subset of it. So we found 6 of the topics that were in the part that they were summarizing and 6 topics that were not in the part that they were summarizing. Then we brought in people who were not involved with the summarization process, and we asked them to look at the summary for a limited amount of time, which would prevent them from just reading everything. And they then, so they had 10 minutes to sort of skim the summary, both the Wickham summary and the Google Docs summary for their 2 separate tests, and also the unsummarized discussion as a third condition. And then we asked them to select which of the 12 discussion points they actually remembered from their examination of the summary. And unfortunately, with such a small population, we did not get the statistical significance that we wanted. But in Wickham, the precision was highest, the recall was highest, and the F1 score was highest compared to the other 2 conditions. And I'd like to go back and get a larger population in order to validate that. How did people use the summaries? Well, some did breadth first search, some did depth first search. It's a tree, so there's different ways to explore a tree. They felt that it was very helpful to have this summary structure. In the Google Doc, again, the summary was a big mess. But with Wickham, there was this structure that helped them navigate and understand what the content was. Right? With these giant discussions, there was this large amount of text, but the summary made it simple to understand the big picture. Now, when we submitted this, reviewer 2 spoke up. It really was reviewer 2, and said that we had not done a good job of testing this tool because Google Docs is such a terrible tool for summarization. It wasn't a fair control. But in fact, that's exactly the point, right? That wikis do not provide good scaffolding for summarization work, and we could do better, right? So the study isn't to say our tool is the best tool, it's to say that we can do much better than we are doing now in supporting people to do this kind of summarization work. So looking forward from this tool, we want to think about better ways of presenting and navigating the summary tree. We want to think about how to gather in unthreaded discussion when there is no tree, how do you gather things together, and this may indeed involve some machine learning, that could be summarized together. Or alternatively, we're also thinking about letting people, separating out the grouping task from the summarization task, let people sort of tag different posts with topics or gather them into groups, and then let somebody else take a group and summarize it. We're also trying to think about how to deal with the fact that sometimes a thread is not coherent, right? Somebody may reply to a thread with something completely irrelevant, and so for that case, you really want to break that thread off there and create a separate summary node for it. We're also considering now, as I said, the real-time discussion and being able to summarize while the discussion is happening and then start replying to summaries instead of having to read through the entire discussion. We've begun doing some field experiments with the Wikimedia Foundation. We're studying their request for comments process and how people need to summarize large discussions in order to decide what to do on Wikipedia. And also there's some digital democracy work. My student Amy, who led this work, spent several weeks in Madrid at a hackathon helping them they have a very active sort of citizen parliament connection. If enough citizens contribute to their online forum, then Parliament has to take up the topic. And so they're very interested in these tools for democratic use. I'm also interested in integrating this summarization process with the annotation process. One sort of grows things and one kind of shrinks them, and I think they could work very well together. So now we've looked at two richer discussion models, annotation and summarization. And both of them, if you think about it, are, yes, go ahead.
So with Wickham, it looks like you're largely looking at discussions and sort of sequential comments.
Mm-hmm.
What about, would you consider looking at knowledge, say, if I talk about here's how to use a computer, maybe the first level is you push the button, and then, oh, here's what the software is doing, here's what the circuits are doing.
Yeah. So if you think about it, any well-written document is hierarchical, right? A textbook will have an introduction, and each chapter will have an introduction, and there's all of these different levels of summarization in a good textbook or other source of knowledge, and that's what's lacking in a discussion. So we're basically trying to get back what is. If you have a carefully edited artifact, it will naturally have the structure already. And yes, you can imagine wanting to make things sort of expandable instead of having it all laid out linearly in order to simplify the reading process. But the challenge with online discussions is that there is no individual providing that organization at the beginning, and so you have to figure out how to lay it on later. Yeah.
How might you deal with attempting to have a system that is trying to summarize text that is ambiguous, or for which there exist multiple valid summarizations?
Yeah. So again, one of the open questions is, sorry, did I have it on the slide? Was quality control, right? So in our discussion, sometimes people wrote terrible summaries, right? And as I said, nobody changed them, but there need to be ways for people to maybe moderate summaries, like upvote them or downvote them, request that they be rewritten to sort of so forth. We've also talked about allowing competing summaries to be written and then letting people sort of vote on which one they like better and so forth.
Yeah, so I have a related question. How do you explain it? Why do people not? Because in Wikipedia, which actually I'm still amazed by the fact that people do it.
Yes.
I still don't know why, but
Yes.
apparently they exist,
Yes.
and they do edit.
Yes.
Right? So why don't they continue to? I mean, they do add and right. Well, Wikipedia page is not like it's not.
No, it keeps changing.
Keep changing. Why don't they? So.
I think this is a cultural issue, right? Like Wikipedia, there is a culture of continuous improvement of all of the content, right?
So why is it here?
Well,
the talk pages, which were disasters.
right. Well, so that's actually where we're pointing Wickham is to the kind of things that happen on talk pages on Wikipedia, which are, again, I mean, they're wiki pages. Technically, they can be edited, but in fact, they just grow linearly, and people keep tacking things on, right? So people know that you edit the wiki page, and they don't edit the talk page. Yeah.
His question though raises, like, it's one thing if you're dealing with engineering, and it's quite another if you're dealing with Shakespeare, right? Where one interpretation might not be any better than another,
Yes,
right? You
absolutely.
can be wrong in engineering.
Yes.
It's hard. You can
Yes.
be wrong in interpreting Shakespeare, but
Yes.
there's a lot more room for multiple perspectives. So how do you think about? I'm not sure if that's what
Yeah.
you're getting
Yeah.
at.
Oh,
How do you think about
It's
that?
a great point, and it is one that we are thinking about. Sort of, and it goes again into this sort of richer hypertext issue, right? So maybe it shouldn't be a tree, right? Maybe you want to have multiple parents of different pieces of content because there are these multiple interpretations or multiple summarizations. Actually, I think I cut that slide, but I'm interested more generally in sort of argumentation systems for sort of people to say, we're having a debate. So here's this point that I want to make, and here is evidence supporting the point, and here is evidence contradicting your point, and here's how I can, if I take these 3 points, then I can draw the following inference, and so forth. I think there is some wonderful rich structure there. It's very challenging to think about how to present it to normal human beings who are not logicians or philosophers in a way that is going to make sense, but that's a direction that I'm hoping to go in. Yes, so there it is right there at the bottom. So capturing notions of assertion and evidence and disagreement and so forth. So these are both special kinds of hypertext, but hypertext, the web is hypertext, but it isn't really. We're not somehow using all of the incredible richness of hypertext for nonlinear text and narrative. And I think part of the reason is that there's this phrase of being lost in hyperspace, and there are lots of cartoons about it in Wikipedia, right? You start here and you always end up on elephants or something, right? So these two tools provide a sort of limited hypertext, right? There's this notion of there's the core content and there's the margins, and everything is attached from the margins to the core content. Or Wickham provides this tree, so you have a down and an up, and you don't get lost moving between down and up. So what other kinds of restrictions on hypertext can we use in order to help people be more able to navigate through it and benefit from the nonlinear structure? So for example, when NB was used in a law class, the students they wrote these 3-page annotations. And so of course other students wanted to annotate the annotations. Right? So how do we do that? Do we have a margin on the margin? Do we let you sort of drag an annotation into the center pane, and now the sidebar becomes the annotations on that center thing, but you can still go back to the original content, and then there would still be a sort of tree structure in terms of layers of annotation. So really interesting questions there. I'll mention now the latest thing we're working on, which is a structured news sharing platform. This was inspired by a sort of weird phenomenon on Facebook. I started getting a lot of anti-vax posts. And it turned out that the reason was that one of my friends who's a doctor was commenting on them, explaining that they were wrong. And so for Facebook, this is a sign of engagement, which means that those posts should be surfaced and shown to more people, which is exactly what the doctor was saying they shouldn't be doing, right? And so the problem is that Facebook only has a notion of this is a comment. It doesn't have any notion of the meaning of the comment, the valence, what is the purpose of that comment. So we're trying out to build a new news sharing platform where the structure that is incorporated is who do you trust, what is true, and how do you know? And so these are now parts of the data model in this news sharing platform. So a person using this platform will create a list of people and organizations that they trust. And when you post something, you are expected to indicate whether you consider it to be accurate, when you see a comment, you can indicate whether, or when you see a post, you can indicate whether you believe it to be accurate or inaccurate. And you can also explain, and you are required to also explain what is your reason, right? Were you an eyewitness to this issue, or are you an expert on the topic, or do you just hope it's true because it makes you feel good? And you're sort of going to have to annotate in this way. And right now we're focusing on annotating whole articles, although we might bring in some of the NB style annotation later. And then once you've got this, we can now sort of digest this information and say, okay, this article is rated as true by a bunch of people who you trust. So we will show you that article in your feed. This article is rated as false, so we will not show it. This article is disputed, so we will flag that it is disputed, and we will see if we can get you to help resolve the dispute by providing your own input on whether it is true or false. This is a screenshot of the current prototype. We're still prototyping the design. We're not, I mean, it's sort of partially functional, but we're certainly not done yet. And so we're giving you filters on sort of different kinds of content that you might want to look at, right? You may want to look at the debated content in order to contribute your own opinions, or you might want to take it easy and just look at things that are known to be true based on your trust network. So here, we've got posts, and over here we're showing you which people have indicated that, or which entities have indicated them to be true, so that you can decide if you want to believe them. You can also navigate to a particular entity and look at what they have rated to be true, so that you can decide maybe it's a new entity, whether you want to trust them or not, and so forth. I mean, that's a detail of the prototype, right? So yes, that is an article that I have marked as being true, and so that's showing in the system.
Okay. But I mean, it seems like Fox News is telling you that Fox News should be trusted.
Yes, that is correct. I mean, we infer that, right? Fox is not a user of our system, but we infer that the poster is asserting that something is true. Okay. So I just showed that. All right. So that was sort of structure. Let me sort of race you through work we're doing on richer workflows. So what do I mean about richer workflows is that sometimes you're getting these massive amounts of content, and you don't have capacity to consume or organize all of that content. So what can we do about that? So we've looked at that in the context of mailing lists first. And we asked the question of why they're still here, right? And at the same time, what's wrong with them and how can we fix it? Email started in 1967. The first mailing list was created in 1971. Obviously, it was recursive to discuss what mailing lists could be used for. And they haven't changed since, right? It is still exactly the same as the 1971 mailing list. There are so many new tools out there, all of the social media platforms for discussion. What else has survived for 40 years unchanged, right? Not much. So we asked why mailing lists are still here. There must be something good about them if they've survived so long. But people are always complaining about them. So what's wrong with them? And can we take the good bits and get rid of the bad bits? And I'm not going to tell you too much about how we did the study because that will take too much time. Basically, we found a couple of mailing lists and interviewed people on those mailing lists. We asked people to compare them to the social media platforms. We found out that, yes, lots of people do use mailing lists, and none of them wanted to switch their traffic to the social media platforms. Why do they prefer mailing lists over social media? Well, they think email is much more serious than social media. They feel that if they move to social media, they'd start seeing cat videos on their mailing lists, which they don't want. They also felt that email was more of a private environment, only used by the participants on the mailing list. Whereas something like Facebook, Big Brother is watching, and everybody else in the world is watching. In fact, it turned out that both of the mailing lists that we were using were public and archived. So anybody in the world could have read anything on either of the mailing lists. But when we told them that, they didn't care. They felt that even though they were technically public, nobody was actually looking. They also felt that email is more likely to be seen by the target than social media, where there's these opaque tools for deciding who gets to see what. And they also especially liked that they could customize their email management, right? This came back a lot, right? I can move my messages into different folders. I can have filtering rules, all of these things that you can't do on social media because the user is not in control. Then we asked about the problems with these mailing lists. And we found three sort of really interesting tensions, which are all caused by the fact that a mailing list has more than one person on it, and everybody has different opinions about how you should do mail. So people had disagreements about what should be on the mailing list, right? Again, mail goes to everybody. It's not like social media, right? So you kind of have to have a communal decision about what is going to be on the mailing list. So on one of our mailing lists, we had some people saying, oh, the good old days when there were these wonderful, wide-ranging discussions on the mailing list. And then you had other people saying, thank God they stopped with those long discussions on the mailing list, right? And so, a third of the people wanted less discussion on their mailing lists. A third of the people wanted more discussion on their mailing lists. We also had these interesting fights over how important should it be before you put it on the mailing list. Some people are like, well, I saw a cat, I should tell my lab. And other people are like, I hate it when people hit reply all and instead of just replying to the one person who asked the question. We also saw these tensions over some people who wanted more interaction in the community versus people who were afraid that everybody else in the community did not like having too much interaction. I've seen this in other systems that we built too, is that all of these participants wanted more, but were afraid that other people wanted less. And in fact, 66% of the people who wanted more discussion on their mailing list had never actually participated in one because they were afraid of bothering everybody else. right? So you don't want to spam large audience. You don't want to be misinterpreted. You don't want to generate heated arguments. You don't want to look stupid. The last tension was over these sort of mental models of how a mailing list works. So some people had this sort of pull model, which says that the content goes out there. This is like clay shirky, publish and filter, right? The content goes out there, and then people can select what they want to read, right? And so this is sort of the social media mental model, right? Other people had the push model that senders are forcing recipients to receive content. And so this is what traditional email is about. And depending on which mental model people had, they'd had different desires and preferences around the mailing list, right? The pull people, they tended to have automatic filtering rules that would put their stuff into folders for them. And so they would sometimes not even read that email because it just went into a folder that they didn't look at. And they would sort of time when they read different topics by looking at different folders at different time. The people with the push model, they just had their inbox, and so they read everything when it arrived. And they really hated missing emails. They wanted to be on top of everything. And sort of you got these different perspectives, right? The pull people were like, well, I can post something else because everybody's just filtering it into mail. I'm not bothering them by posting. But the people who used push were really leery about sending an email because they assumed everybody else had this push model as well. So, in summary, email has this appeal. It's more serious, more private. You know who's reading it, and you know that they are reading it as opposed to missing it. And you have more control over how to read and organize it. On the flip side, there are these tensions where everybody disagrees about how much content should actually be going on that mailing list and how do people consume it. And really, a lot of it is about control, right? Each person wants to control their inflow of information. And everybody wants to control it differently. And there's sort of this negotiation that has to happen between multiple parties. So in order to address this, we've been trying to build a new mailing list platform called Murmur, which gives people more control over what they are going to receive on a mailing list. And again, this is up. You can play with it. You might ask why we're doing this instead of social media, but I've been explaining to you that people care a lot about mailing lists. It also tends to be easier to work with email. Like, we don't have to understand the APIs for these different social media platforms. We just need to write a tool that talks IMAP, and it works with, and everybody gets to keep using their favorite email client. They don't have to change anything. And so we've designed in a lot of things based on these interviews, right? So people can, for example, say that they only want to get the first post on a thread and have the system not put anything else into their mailbox unless they indicate that they're interested in that post. We're also incorporating from social media things like tagging a message and upvoting it. And now we let people write rules like only put this in my inbox if it gets more than 10 upvotes, or look at all emails from this person but don't look at emails from this person, and so forth, to give them more of that control that they would like to have. Yeah, so ignore Adam because he's always posting silly things, but we also try and design for reluctant senders. So this worry about spamming everybody on the mailing list, what can we do about that? Well, we can allow senders to intentionally limit distribution. So one model is we send this, when you post something, it only goes to a few people. And if they upvote it, it goes to more people. Okay? But now it's not the system deciding to do this, it's the sender deciding to do this. Right? And so this can encourage them to that they're not spamming everybody, but giving people an opportunity to say that they're interested in it. Right? Or people can send only to people who are following a particular tag. Or you can send to everybody except a certain troll on the mailing list who always complains when you post things. Right? Now, there's an interesting question about whether that's ethical. Right? If you have a community mailing list, should you be allowed to send to everybody except one person? I think that's kind of interesting. Another really interesting thing that we saw was, and that's inspired another project, was people were afraid of looking stupid, and this was specifically some people with limited English speaking capabilities. They wanted, when they sent something, for it to go to a few of their friends who would check it and block it if it was not a good idea to send to the mailing list. But would otherwise allow it through, and it would go to everybody. So this again addressed sort of sender reluctance. I see I'm over time, so I'm just going to mention that we then took this in another sort of direction, where we looked at email harassment. So one of the things that's very common in online harassment is to try and get your friends to help out. And the way this is currently done is people give their friends the passwords to their social media accounts, and they ask them to actually go in and clean up their, to delete all of the nasty posts before the person comes and actually reads their messages. The theory, I think, is that a harassing message directed at me is not going to have the same impact on my friends. And so we discovered this was quite common. And so we've built a system called Squadbox. Let me just show you the icon, which provides a workflow scaffold for your friends. So basically what Squadbox does is it intercepts email that's being sent to you, and it puts it into a moderation queue that your friends can look at. And we interviewed a lot of harassment victims and discovered that they have many different ways of dealing with the harassment, what they want done with the messages, how they want them annotated or organized, which ones should be sent and which ones should go on and to the recipient and which ones should not. All of that is stuff that's captured in the Squadbox workflow model, so that you don't have to give people the passwords to your social media accounts anymore. Instead, they have a system that is specifically dedicated to handling this moderation workflow. And Squadbox is up as well. And you can, if there is, God forbid, anybody who's suffering from harassment who you know, this tool is available and ready to use. Our preliminary experiments show that it's quite usable and people like it. So I'd love for us to find some people who we can help out with this tool. All right, so I think I'll conclude with that. We've got other sort of workflow projects as well, but I can talk to you about those tomorrow when we meet. Let me just conclude with the sort of message that I gave at the beginning, which is that our current computer tools are too limiting. They don't have the representations or the workflows that people are perfectly capable of and in fact desire to use to manage their information. And there are many opportunities to make things better by enriching the data models and enriching the workflows that will support what people actually want to do. Now, you might object that all of this control is too complicated, that everybody wants it and nobody will use it. But in fact, I believe there is this sort of theory of what's called the gardeners, that there are always a few people who are willing to put in the extra time to understand tools better and do more interesting things with them. And I think if we can empower them, it will improve the quality of information for everyone who's making use of that information. And so it looks like in the editing of my slides, I lost the thank you slide. So that's the end. Thank you very much.